Why did the toughest sheriff in Kansas keep chasing the same woman, only to show up one day carrying something far more dangerous than handcuffs? The train whistles screamed across the station as Wyatt Mercer pushed through the crowd, his boots pounding against the wooden platform. Steam rolled between him and Ruby Bennett. Her travel bag was already in her hand. The old gold ring felt heavy in his pocket. Around them, strangers fell silent, watching. Ruby turned toward him, and whatever he had come to say suddenly seemed impossible to speak aloud. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and join us for this unforgettable journey. Dodge City, Kansas, autumn 1887. The wind carried dust down Front Street and rattled the loose sign above the Long Branch Saloon. Wagons rolled through ruts hardened by months of traffic. Somewhere near the stockyards, a hammer rang against iron. It sounded like any other morning in Dodge City. Sheriff Wyatt Mercer sat behind his desk in the Ford County Sheriff's Office, reading a warrant that had arrived just after sunrise. The paper smelled faintly of cigar smoke. Complaint filed by Silas Crow, 2 horses missing. Suspect, Ruby Bennett. Wyatt folded the warrant and slipped it into his coat pocket. Across the room, Deputy Frank Ellis looked from a ledger. Crow again? Wyatt nodded. Frank leaned back in his chair. Man loses a horse, he sends a telegram. Loses a spoon, he'd probably send the governor. Wyatt allowed the corner of his mouth to move, but only slightly. Silas Crow owned more land than most men would ride across in a week. He also had a habit of believing every inconvenience deserved official attention. Still, a warrant was a warrant. An hour later, Wyatt was riding south beyond the edges of town. The prairie stretched beneath a pale sky. Dry grass rolled in waves beneath the wind. Cottonwoods lined a narrow creek several miles from the main road. That was where he found her. Not hiding, not running, not even watching the road. Ruby Bennett knelt beside a chestnut mare in a shallow valley. The horse could barely stand. One foreleg trembled each time it shifted its weight. Ruby was wrapping a clean strip of cloth around the animal's injured leg. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows. Dust marked the hem of her brown skirt. A tin bucket sat nearby. She looked up only when Wyatt's horse stepped onto a patch of loose gravel. For a moment, neither spoke. Wyatt had expected a thief. Instead, he found a woman carefully pouring water into her hand so a frightened horse would drink. "You Ruby Bennett?" he asked. She nodded once. "You're not very hard to find." A faint smile touched her face. "Maybe you aren't very hard to predict." Wyatt dismounted. His boots crunched softly against the ground. The horses belonged to Silas Crow. Ruby glanced toward the mare. "No." Wyatt waited. She tightened the bandage. "They belonged to Silas Crow yesterday." The wind moved through the grass. The mare lowered its head against Ruby's shoulder. Wyatt studied the animal. He noticed the ribs, the scars, the raw marks beneath the saddle blanket. None of it matched the picture painted in the complaint. Still, the warrant remained in his pocket. The law did not ask for opinions. It asked for action. "Ruby Bennett," he said quietly, "you're under arrest." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. No argument, no attempt to run, no anger, only one question. "Will somebody feed her?" Wyatt frowned. "The horse?" Ruby stood slowly. "The horse." He reached for the cuffs. She held out her wrists. "The mare needs oats twice today," she said, "and fresh water before dark." Wyatt clicked one cuff into place. "Do you understand what I just said?" "Yes. And you're worried about the horse?" Ruby's eyes moved back toward the animal. Someone should be. The ride back to Dodge City took nearly 3 hours. The afternoon sun drifted lower. Dust followed the horses. Ruby rode beside him with her hands secured in front of her. She never asked to be released. Never claimed innocence. Never blamed Silas Crow. Twice she asked whether the mare had water. Once she asked if someone could remove a loose shoe from the second horse. Nothing else. By the time they reached town, Wyatt was more confused than when he'd left. People usually talked when they were arrested. They defended themselves. They lied. They begged. Ruby Bennett did none of those things. The courthouse stood beside the main square. Its brick walls glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Judge Walter Harlan heard the case the next morning. Silas Crowe arrived dressed in black wool and expensive boots. Ruby arrived wearing the same dust-stained clothes from the day before. The courtroom filled quickly. Crowe spoke loudly. Ruby barely spoke at all. When the witnesses were called, problems appeared. One ranch hand admitted he had never actually seen Ruby take the horses. Another could not identify the date. A third changed part of his story halfway through testimony. The case weakened with every question. Judge Harlan finally removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I find insufficient evidence to support the full charge. Silas Crowe's jaw tightened. The judge continued. A minor fine will be assessed pending further review. The gavel struck. The room exhaled. People stood. Benches scraped across wooden floors. Ruby was free. Wyatt watched as she walked down the courthouse steps into the cool autumn air. For reasons he could not explain, he followed. She stopped near the hitching rail. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Ruby looked toward the busy street. A freight wagon rolled past. Men laughed outside a cafe. Life continued. They always see the rope, she said quietly. Wyatt turned toward her. What? Ruby rested one hand on the rail. They always see the rope on my wrists. Her gaze drifted somewhere beyond the town. Nobody ever sees the wounds on a horse's back. The wind lifted a strand of hair near her cheek. Then she walked away. No farewell, no accusation, no bitterness, just those words. Wyatt remained standing there long after she disappeared into the crowd. That evening he sat alone in his office. A cup of coffee cooled beside his elbow. Outside, Dodge City settled into darkness. The jail was quiet. The streets were quieter. He should have forgotten her. A sheriff had more important things to think about. Then the office door burst open. Deputy Frank Ellis stepped inside, holding another report. Wyatt. Something in his voice sounded unusual. Wyatt looked up. Frank handed him the paper. Another horse theft. Wyatt unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page. A witness statement, a location, a description. Then one familiar name, Ruby Bennett. Wyatt stared at the report. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Kansas night. And for the second time in 1 year, the same woman had found her way back into his life, whether he wanted her there or not. The report sat on Wyatt Mercer's desk until nearly midnight. A kerosene lamp burned low beside it. Outside, the wind rattled the jailhouse sign. Inside, the sheriff read the witness statement again. 2 horses missing from a grazing pasture south of the Arkansas River. 1 witness, 1 name, Ruby Bennett. Wyatt folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat. 3 days later, he rode south beneath a gray winter sky. The prairie looked different now. The grass had turned pale. Frost lingered in shaded places. The creek beds ran low. He followed wagon tracks for nearly 12 miles before finding the place. It wasn't a ranch. It wasn't even much of a farm. Just an abandoned homestead sitting alone beneath a cluster of cottonwoods. One broken fence, a leaning barn, a roof patched with different kinds of wood. Smoke drifted from a small chimney. Wyatt dismounted quietly. Then he stopped. There were horses everywhere. Not fine horses, not valuable horses. Broken horses, thin horses, old horses. Animals with scars across their shoulders. Animals with worn hooves. Animals that should have been dead months ago. Yet they stood in the winter sunlight chewing hay, alive. A boy no older than 12 carried water from a barrel. An old farrier hammered a loose shoe back into place. 2 native children brushed mud from a mare's legs. Nobody appeared frightened. Nobody appeared forced. And standing in the middle of it all was Ruby Bennett. She looked up before Wyatt spoke. "You're early this time." Her voice carried across the yard. The old farrier glanced toward Wyatt. The children did too. Nobody ran, nobody hid. Wyatt looked around. "These the stolen horses?" Ruby followed his gaze. Some of them. The answer irritated him. That's not how this works. Ruby wiped her hands on a cloth. No. The way it works is they get worked half to death, thrown away, and somebody pretends not to notice. The old farrier quietly returned to his work. Nobody argued with her. That bothered Wyatt more than if they had. He pulled the warrant from his coat. Ruby looked at it, then at him. Then she held out her wrists, just like the first time. Before we leave, she said, would you mind helping Jimmy carry those feed sacks into the shed? Wyatt blinked. You're under arrest. I know. Then why are you asking me for favors? Ruby nodded toward the small boy struggling with a sack nearly half his size. Because he'll hurt his back. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Wyatt sighed. 20 minutes later, he found himself carrying feed sacks into a shed while a woman under arrest supervised where they should go. The realization annoyed him. The fact that nobody found it strange annoyed him even more. The ride back to Dodge City felt different this time. Ruby still didn't defend herself, still didn't complain. But Wyatt's mind kept returning to what he had seen. The horses, the children, the old farrier, the worn blankets carefully stitched and repaired. People did not gather around dangerous people that way. Weeks passed after Ruby paid another small fine. Winter settled across Kansas. The first snow arrived late one evening. Then something strange began happening. Wyatt started seeing Ruby everywhere, not because he was looking for her, because she seemed to appear wherever somebody needed help. One afternoon, he spotted her helping Mrs. Holloway, a widow whose wagon wheel had broken outside town. Another morning, he saw her carrying medicine from Dr. Finch's clinic to a family living beyond the creek. A week later, a young ranch hand arrived at the sheriff's office after being kicked by a horse. The boy mentioned that Ruby had cleaned the wound before sending him to town. No charge, Wyatt asked. The boy laughed. Miss Bennett doesn't charge for much. Word traveled quickly in Dodge City. People noticed things, especially when winter left everyone with little else to discuss. Conversations stopped when Wyatt entered cafes. Smiles appeared where they hadn't before. One evening, he walked into Clara's diner for coffee. The waitress set down his cup. Then she smirked. How's Miss Bennett? Wyatt nearly choked on the first sip. Across the room, somebody laughed. He finished his coffee and left. But the rumors stayed, and so did the questions. By February, even Captain Owen Briggs called him into the county office. The older lawman closed the door behind them. Rain tapped softly against the window. Briggs sat behind a desk covered in paperwork. For a long moment, he simply watched Wyatt. Then he said, You know what people are saying. Wyatt stared back. People always say things. Not usually about my sheriff. Silence settled between them. Briggs leaned back in his chair. I've watched you for years. Wyatt waited. The captain folded his hands. That woman keeps ending up wherever your investigations lead. Wyatt said nothing. Briggs nodded slowly. That's what worries me. The room felt smaller somehow. Finally, the captain spoke again. His voice was quieter now. Son, the day you stop seeing her as a suspect and start seeing her as something else. He paused. The rain continued outside. Is the day you'll have to choose between that badge and your heart. For the first time in years, Wyatt had no answer ready. He looked toward the window, toward the wet streets of Dodge City, toward a winter sky hanging low above the prairie. Then he stood. I don't know what you're talking about. Briggs studied him. The older man didn't smile. He didn't argue, he simply nodded. That's what I used to tell myself too. Wyatt left the office. The rain followed him home. That night he sat alone at his kitchen table. A coffee cup cooled beside a stack of reports. The clock ticked steadily. He tried reading, failed. Tried sleeping, failed again. Finally, he found himself staring through the window at nothing. And without meaning to, he remembered a woman standing in a cold yard surrounded by unwanted horses. A woman who always held out her wrists before he asked. A woman who seemed more concerned about injured animals than herself. A woman the whole town called a thief. A woman he could no longer fit neatly inside that word. Somewhere outside, a train whistle echoed across the dark prairie. Wyatt listened until the sound faded. Then he realized something that unsettled him far more than any rumor in Dodge City ever could. For the first time in his life, he wasn't entirely sure Captain Briggs was wrong. Spring came and went. The prairie turned green. The Arkansas River ran fuller than it had in months. And for a while, life seemed determined to leave Wyatt Mercer alone. It didn't. The trouble arrived in July. The complaint came from Silas Crow himself. Not through a ranch foreman, not through a lawyer. Crow marched into the sheriff's office, carrying a leather folder, and enough anger to fill the room. "My stallion is gone." Wyatt looked up from a stack of property records. What stallion? Sovereign. That got everyone's attention. Even Deputy Frank Ellis stopped writing. Sovereign was famous across 3 counties. A tall gray breeding horse worth more than some ranches. Crow dropped papers onto Wyatt's desk. Witness statements, inventory records, signed affidavits. Every piece pointed toward one person, Ruby Bennett. By sunset, Wyatt was riding east toward Flint Hills. Heat shimmered above the grasslands. The sky stretched endlessly overhead. His horse climbed a narrow ridge before descending into an old grazing valley surrounded by limestone bluffs. A weathered barn stood alone near a dry creek bed. The door hung partially open. Wyatt dismounted. Something felt wrong immediately. Too quiet, no voices, no tools, no horses moving in the corrals, only wind. He stepped inside. The smell of hay and dust filled the barn. Then he saw her. Ruby sat on the straw-covered floor. One hand rested gently against the neck of a gray stallion. Sovereign. The horse lay motionless, its breathing shallow. Its coat should have gleamed silver. Instead, it looked dull beneath the filtered light coming through the boards. Marks crossed its sides, old injuries, neglect, exhaustion. Ruby didn't look up right away. She simply sat there, her hand moving slowly through the horse's mane. Wyatt had seen her angry. He had seen her amused. He had seen her stubborn. This was different. A tear slipped down her cheek. She never wiped it away. The silence inside the barn felt heavier than any argument. Finally, she spoke. They were done with him. Her voice barely carried. He couldn't earn money anymore. Wyatt looked at the horse. Then at her. Ruby lowered her eyes. They were going to throw him away. No accusation. No performance, just exhaustion. For a long moment, Wyatt forgot why he had come. Then his fingers touched the warrant in his coat pocket. The paper suddenly felt heavier than iron. Ruby, she closed her eyes, not because she was surprised, because she already knew. When she opened them again, she stood slowly. The horse remained on the straw behind her. "I know." The words landed softly between them. Wyatt couldn't find anything else to say, not at first. The law had always been simple. Find evidence, make arrest. Let the court decide. Yet standing there, none of it felt simple anymore. He looked at Sovereign, looked at Ruby, then back at the warrant. "I have to take you in," she nodded. "I know. No anger, no pleading. That somehow made it worse." Wyatt reached for the handcuffs. His hands hesitated. For the first time in his career, he wished he could leave them where they were. Ruby extended her wrists, just as she had before. But this time she never looked at him. Not once. The metal clicked shut. The sound echoed through the barn. Wyatt felt something tighten inside his chest. Ruby still didn't look up. That hurt more than any accusation could have. The ride back to Dodge City happened beneath a burning sunset. Neither spoke. The miles passed slowly. By the time they reached town, news had already spread. People gathered outside the courthouse. Whispers followed them. Sovereign's disappearance. Silas Crow's demands. Rumors of prison. Judge Harlan set the hearing date for the following month. Then came the announcement everyone feared. Crow's attorney stood before the courtroom and spoke clearly enough for every person present to hear. My client intends to pursue the maximum penalty available. 5 years. The words traveled across the room like a cold wind. Ruby remained still. Wyatt watched her profile. She never reacted, but he noticed her hands tightened for just a second. Only a second. Then they relaxed again. That night, Dodge City settled into darkness. The jail lantern burned outside Ruby's cell. Across town, Wyatt sat alone at his kitchen table. A cup of coffee had gone cold hours earlier. Stacks of reports remained untouched. The clock ticked steadily. Midnight passed then. 1 o'clock. Still he sat there, thinking about a gray stallion. Thinking about a woman who cared more about injured horses than her own freedom. Thinking about the way she had refused to look at him. Outside, thunder rolled far across the prairie. Inside, Wyatt finally reached for the complaint file. He opened it, read every page again, then a third time. Something didn't fit. Something about Silas Crow's story felt wrong. Very wrong. Near dawn, Wyatt closed the folder. The first light of morning appeared beyond the window. He had made a decision. For the first time, he wasn't going to investigate Ruby Bennett. He was going to investigate the man accusing her. And before the summer was over, that choice would cost him everything he had spent a lifetime building. The first person Wyatt visited was an old veterinarian named Dr. Samuel Pierce. The doctor lived 20 miles west of Dodge City in a weathered white house surrounded by wind-bent cottonwoods. Pierce answered the door, holding a coffee mug stained by years of use. He listened without interruption, while Wyatt explained why he had come. Then he disappeared inside and returned carrying a wooden box filled with records, receipts, treatment notes, dates, names. For nearly 2 hours they sat at a kitchen table while late summer sunlight crept across the floorboards. Again and again the same name appeared: Silas Crow. Broken horses, collapsed draft animals, severe neglect. Requests for treatment that arrived too late. Pierce tapped one yellowed document with a finger. I stopped asking questions years ago. Why? Wyatt asked. The old doctor stared out the window. Because men with money don't like questions. That answer stayed with Wyatt long after he rode away. The second witness lived near Cimarron Crossing, a farrier named Owen Fletcher. The man's shop smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. Sparks jumped from the forge while horses shifted inside the stable. When Wyatt mentioned Crow's name, Fletcher stopped hammering. The silence lasted several seconds. Then he removed his leather gloves. You writing this down officially? Wyatt hesitated. No. Fletcher nodded slowly. That seemed to matter. The farrier walked to a shelf and pulled out an old ledger. Several pages listed horses brought from Crow's ranch. Animals worked beyond reasonable limits. Animals never given time to recover. Animals replaced instead of cared for. You didn't hear it from me, Fletcher said. But half the county already knows. More names followed, more conversations. A ranch hand missing 2 fingers from an old accident. A freight driver who had transported Crow's livestock. An elderly cattleman who remembered horses disappearing whenever they became unprofitable. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer and uglier. By October, Wyatt's saddlebags were filled with statements, signed affidavits, receipts, veterinary records, enough evidence to make any honest court take notice, but not enough to make powerful people happy. The warning arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon. Captain Briggs stood inside the sheriff's office with a folded letter in his hand. The older man's face looked older than usual. Wyatt knew immediately. Bad news. Briggs placed the letter on the desk. You've made enemies, I noticed. I'm serious. So am I. Briggs sighed. Outside, wagon wheels rattled across Front Street. Inside, neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, the captain sat down. You need to stop. Wyatt looked at him. The word sounded wrong coming from Briggs. The man had spent his entire career preaching honesty. Stop what? You know exactly what. Briggs rubbed tired eyes. The county board is angry. The district attorney is angry. Crow is furious. Wyatt leaned back in his chair. Good. The captain's jaw tightened. "Listen to me." His voice dropped lower. "They'll let Ruby Bennett stand trial. They'll let the court decide. But if you keep pushing this, they'll come after you too." Wyatt said nothing. Briggs watched him. Then asked the question neither of them wanted to ask. "Is she worth it?" The room became very quiet. A clock ticked somewhere near the jail corridor. Wyatt looked down at the evidence stacked on his desk, the witness statements, the records, the truth. Then he answered, "That's not the question." Briggs frowned. "Then what is?" Wyatt looked directly at him. "The question is whether the truth is worth it." For a moment, the older man seemed almost proud. Then the feeling disappeared. By November, the pressure grew worse. County officials demanded he hand over the investigation. The district attorney refused to review several statements. Rumors spread through town. Some people supported him. Others didn't. At Clara's diner, conversations stopped when he entered. At the feed store, men lowered their voices. Even Deputy Frank Ellis seemed uncertain what to say anymore. Only Ruby never asked him for anything. She remained in custody awaiting trial. Once each week, Wyatt checked the jail records personally. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to know she was safe. One evening he found a blanket folded neatly outside her cell. The weather had turned bitter. Someone had left it there. Wyatt never discovered who. But when he passed the cell later, he noticed Ruby reading beside the lantern. The blanket covered her shoulders. For a brief second their eyes met. Neither smiled, neither spoke. Still, something passed between them. A quiet understanding. Then the moment was gone. The first snow arrived 3 days later. Dodge City woke beneath white rooftops and frozen streets. That same morning, Wyatt Mercer walked into the county building, carrying a single envelope. The clerk looked confused. "So early?" Wyatt nodded. The envelope rested heavily in his hand. Years of service, years of sacrifice. Everything reduced to a few sheets of paper. He stepped into Captain Briggs's office. The older lawman saw the envelope immediately. Neither man spoke, neither had to. Slowly, Wyatt placed it on the desk. Briggs closed his eyes. For a long moment, he simply sat there. Then he opened the envelope, read the first line, and exhaled. "You really mean to do this? It wasn't a question." Wyatt nodded. Outside the window, snow drifted across the empty street. Inside the office, the badge on Wyatt's chest suddenly felt lighter, and somehow heavier at the same time. "I can't wear it anymore," he said quietly. Briggs stared at the resignation letter, then at the man standing before him. Finally he stood, walked around the desk, and offered his hand. Wyatt took it. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. By sunset, the news had spread across Dodge City. Sheriff Wyatt Mercer had resigned. The town could hardly believe it. Some blamed politics. Some blamed Crow. Some blamed pride. Nobody knew the truth. Nobody except one woman sitting behind iron bars in the county jail. And as winter settled over Kansas, the trial that would change both of their lives moved one step closer. The courthouse was already crowded before sunrise. Men stamped snow from their boots near the entrance. Women wrapped shawls tighter against the cold. Every bench inside the courtroom filled before Judge Harlan even arrived. People came because of Silas Crow. People stayed because of Ruby Bennett. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Wyatt Mercer. No badge, no title. Just a man carrying a stack of papers thick enough to change the direction of a case. The trial lasted 3 days. Crow's attorneys spoke first. They presented ownership records, witness statements, business contracts. Everything looked neat. Everything looked proper. Then Wyatt's evidence began to appear, one witness at a time. An old veterinarian, a farrier, former ranch hands, freight drivers, men who had spent years working around Crow's livestock. One after another, they described exhausted horses abandoned after injuries. Records appeared showing repeated neglect. Receipts surfaced that contradicted Crow's own claims. By the second afternoon, the mood inside the courtroom had changed. Crow no longer looked confident. He looked angry. Judge Harlan listened carefully, asked questions, read documents twice, sometimes 3 times. When the proceedings finally ended, silence settled across the room. The judge removed his spectacles, folded his hands, and delivered his decision. Ruby Bennett would be released immediately. The charges were dismissed. The evidence against her could not stand. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then a murmur spread through the courtroom. Ruby lowered her eyes. Wyatt simply sat there. Relief felt strangely quiet after carrying so much weight for so long. Outside, snow fell softly across Dodge City. Life slowly returned to normal, at least for everyone else. Silas Crow lost contracts, lost influence, lost friends who no longer wished to stand beside him. Ruby gained something far less tangible. People finally looked at her differently. Store owners greeted her by name. Children waved when she passed. The same town that once whispered now nodded respectfully. Yet none of it changed her decision. Spring arrived early in 1889. The snow disappeared. Grass returned. The trains began running more regularly west toward Colorado. And Ruby Bennett bought a ticket. The news reached Wyatt through Deputy Frank Ellis, or rather former Deputy Frank Ellis. The 2 men were drinking coffee in Clara's diner when Frank mentioned it. "She leaves Thursday." Wyatt stopped with the cup halfway to his mouth. Frank pretended not to notice. "Morning train." Silence. Then Frank looked up. "You planning to let her go?" Wyatt stared through the window. A wagon rolled slowly past. Across the street, a dog slept beneath a hitching rail. Everything looked ordinary. Nothing felt ordinary. Thursday arrived clear and bright. The train station buzzed with activity. Porters loaded trunks. Families exchanged goodbyes. Steam drifted from the locomotive waiting on the tracks. Ruby stood near the boarding platform carrying a single travel bag. She looked calm, the same way she had looked during every arrest, the same way she had looked during every accusation, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. Then movement caught her eye. Wyatt Mercer was crossing the platform. No sheriff's star, no revolver belt, no warrant, just a plain brown coat and dust-covered boots. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the station seemed to fade. Then Wyatt reached into his pocket. Several people nearby noticed. They watched curiously. Ruby did too. He removed a small velvet box. Old, worn at the corners, his mother's ring rested inside. A thin gold band with a small stone that caught the morning light. Ruby looked at it, then at him. Wyatt cleared his throat. For a man who had testified before judges and faced armed outlaws, he suddenly looked uncertain. 3 times, he said quietly. Ruby waited. 3 times I took you to court. The train released a long whistle. Steam rolled across the platform. Wyatt smiled faintly. Darn near took me a year to understand the only place I ever wanted to take you was home. The words hung between them. Simple, honest, nothing rehearsed, nothing fancy, just the truth. Ruby stared at him. For a second, he wondered if he had waited too long. Then she reached into her travel bag. Folded carefully between several papers was an old document, yellowed, creased, preserved. Wyatt recognized it immediately. The report from her first arrest. Ruby unfolded it gently. A smile touched her face. "You took longer than I expected." He blinked. Ruby laughed softly. The first genuine laugh he had heard from her in months. Then she folded the paper again, placed it back into her bag, and offered him her hand. The crowd around them erupted before either of them realized what was happening. Someone clapped. Others followed. Even the conductor grinned. The train eventually pulled away, without Ruby Bennett aboard. That evening, 2 horses left Dodge City heading west beneath a sky painted gold and blue. One rider was a former sheriff. The other was the woman he had arrested 3 times. The prairie stretched endlessly before them. No courtroom, no jail, no accusations. Just open country and a future neither of them could see yet. For a while they rode in comfortable silence. Then Ruby glanced sideways. "Wyatt?" You know something? What? She smiled toward the horizon. I never doubted you'd come around. The wind carried her laughter across the prairie, and for the first time since he had seen her kneeling beside an injured horse in a distant valley, Wyatt Mercer laughed too. The sun slipped lower. Their shadows stretched across the grass, and together they rode toward a new life where neither of them had to stand alone again. As the prairie swallowed the last light of day, Dodge City slowly disappeared behind them. The courthouse was still there. The jail was still there. The dusty streets, the rumors, the long months of doubt and waiting, all of it remained in the distance. But some things are worth leaving behind. Sometimes the hardest road in life isn't the one that takes you through storms. It's the one that asks you to trust someone after you've been hurt, to believe in goodness after disappointment, to open your heart when it would be easier to keep it closed. Imagine yourself standing where Ruby once stood, accused, misunderstood, ready to leave everything behind. Or maybe standing where Wyatt stood, forced to choose between what was expected of him and what he knew was right. Would you have had the courage to stay, the courage to wait, the courage to believe that someone deserved a second chance, and that maybe you did too? What stays with me about their story isn't the arrests or the courtroom. It's the quiet truth hidden beneath all of it. Real love doesn't arrive with perfect timing. Sometimes it grows slowly through trust, sacrifice, forgiveness, and the choice to keep showing up when walking away would be easier. I'd love to know your thoughts. At what moment do you think Wyatt truly fell in love with Ruby? And if this journey touched your heart, I hope you'll stay a while. There are many more stories waiting ahead. Stories about hope, healing, unexpected friendships, and the kind of love that finds people when they least expect it. Until then, thank you for riding along with us.